In the previous video, we introduced the immune cells. Now let's talk about immune structures, immune tissues, where we find these immune cells. So we're going to find immune cells everywhere because pathogens can be everywhere. As you think about the different areas of the body that we're going to find pathogens, I want you to think about the concept that immune cells have to develop in certain locations of the body. They have to travel throughout the body. Once they get to an area, they might want to patrol and try to detect pathogens. If they detect a pathogen, they'll have to activate and then turn on their effector function to actually help the immune system get rid of the pathogen. So immune cells are going to be in lots of different places doing lots of different things. There's lots of movement of immune cells, lots of places they can be, again, because pathogens can be in a lot of different places as well. So just keep these sort of 5 ideas in your mind as we explore the body and where we're going to find immune cells. So the first place we're going to talk about in the body that you find immune cells are in primary lymphoid tissues. So we introduced the concept of red bone marrow that you find in many of your long bones, areas that have spongy bones. This is called primary lymphoid tissue. That's where we find our stem cells in our red bone marrow. We're also going to refer to the thymus, which is a gland in your chest, also as primary lymphoid tissue. Now, wait, do we find bone marrow in the thymus? No. But what we're going to see is that some cells leave the bone marrow, go to the thymus, and continue developing. So primary lymphoid tissue refers to the tissue where immune cells develop. Specifically in the thymus, we're going to have T cells or T lymphocytes. That's where they finish undergoing development in the thymus. So most immune cells finish their development in the bone marrow, but the T cells will finish their immune cell development in the thymus. So both of these are referred to as primary lymphoid tissue. Well, if we have primary lymphoid tissue, we probably have secondary lymphoid tissue. This is going to refer to tissues throughout the body that basically act like filters that will sample substances captured from the environment to detect for pathogens. So what are we talking about when we talk about secondary lymphoid tissue? Well, we're really talking about the lymphatic system. So what is the lymphatic system? It's a series of tubes, which we can call lymphatics or lymph vessels. And these tubes act almost like sewer pipes. They capture fluid drained from our tissues and our organs throughout the body, almost like a sewer system. That fluid that you find in the lymphatic vessel is known as lymph fluid. And that fluid collects into these little nodes or filtering stations, right? They're called lymph nodes. And we find a lot of lymph nodes internally in our body, our neck, our chest, under our arms, in our groin, under our knees. So these lymph nodes will contain immune cells, as well as lymph fluid, which again is drained and collected from a variety of organs and tissues in the body. So lymph nodes are secondary lymphoid tissues. There are also these lymphoid tissues that are present right underneath many of our tubes. Remember, the human body is basically made up of a bunch of tubes. The digestive system, the GI system, it's a big tube, and that tube's exposed to pathogen. So embedded within the secondary lymphoid, embedded within many of our organ systems, like our gut, our GI system, are patches of lymphoid tissues, which act very similar to lymph nodes. So GALT, for example, refers to gut-associated lymphoid tissue. These are tissues within our GI tract, for example, in our intestines. Our intestines function to break down food, absorb food, right? But within the small intestine, we have patches of lymphoid tissue known as Peyer's patches. These are secondary lymphoid tissues. They are used to collect things from the environment and maybe look for some pathogens. In our throat, we have our tonsils and our adenoids. Those, again, are lymphoid tissues that are within our throat that, again, will sample for pathogens. Immune cells will be in the adenoids and the tonsils, and they can find pathogens and activate. Within our respiratory system, our lungs, right, our lung tissue functions for gas exchange, but within that bronchial tissue is bronchial-associated lymphoid tissue, BALT. So you'll find immune cells within the BALT structures, the lymphoid tissues within our lungs, because as we inhale pathogens, viruses, bacteria, fungi, those pathogens can get sampled by cells, immune cells, within the lymphoid tissue in our lungs. That's the BALT. The MALT, mucosal associated lymphoid tissues, are also generalized lymphoid tissues we found throughout any of our mucosal tubes. The appendix and the spleen are also part of secondary lymphoid tissues. They will contain immune cells. Our spleen is there to filter our blood. The spleen contains immune cells, but will also try to capture any pathogens that are present in the blood. So we're going to find immune cells activating in our secondary lymphoid tissues. Not the only place they activate, but that's where they are often patrolling and activating. All right, so where else are we going to find immune cells? Well, we find immune cells in our blood. Typically, they are using the circulatory system to travel, right? Immune cells, also known as white blood cells, also known as leukocytes. You're going to find immune cells in the blood. Often, they're just using the circulatory system as a transport mechanism. So if you look in your circulatory system, remember, your blood is made of the cellular fraction and the liquid fraction being plasma. We're going to find a bunch of immune proteins in the plasma. We'll get to that later. But in the cellular fraction of your blood, that's made of mostly red blood cells and a teeny tiny percentage of white blood cells or leukocytes. Within that fraction of white blood cells, you will find neutrophils, lymphocytes like B lymphocytes and T lymphocytes, monocytes, eosinophils, and basophils in the percentages, approximate percentages shown in that table. So if you ever want to remember the abundance of all the immune cells that you find in your bloodstream, you can remember the mnemonic, never let monkeys eat bananas, for neutrophils, lymphocytes, which encompass B lymphocytes, T lymphocytes, and neutrophils, monocytes, eosinophils, and basophils. So we're going to find immune cells in our blood. No surprise, right there, we call them white blood cells. We're also going to find immune cells within our tissues, within our connective tissues, within other tissues in the body. So immune cells can leave the blood and enter our tissues. We'll see neutrophils entering tissues. We'll see monocytes entering tissues. Now, monocytes, when they enter our tissues, will actually continue differentiating into their final stage, either being macrophages or dendritic cells. If you recall, right, what are macrophages and dendritic cells? They are phagocytes. They go to phagocytose pathogens or other abnormal structures that they see. Why do we have two types of pathogens in the tissues? Actually, three types. Neutrophils also phagocytes. Why do we have three different types of phagocytes within our tissues? We'll get to that later when we cover specific functions of each of these immune cells. But again, you're going to find immune cells within our tissues, within our connective tissues, within our organs, within our liver, within our kidney, within our lung tissue. You're going to find immune cells crawling around, patrolling. Right? Here I've drawn some part of the lymphatic system, specifically a lymph vessel. Again, think of these as drainage systems, almost like sewer systems. They are one-way vessels. They have valves in them, and they will collect fluid from our tissues, interstitial fluid, any of extra fluids, any swelled fluid, and then the fluid collects through the lymph vessels to these nodes along these vessels called lymph nodes, and you will find lymph fluid in here. What do you find in lymph? It's mostly interstitial fluid, but dead and dying cells, debris, pathogens. We'll see that shortly. So in our lymph nodes, we're also going to find immune cells. How do they get there? They use the circulatory system to transport and then move from the circulatory system, from the blood, into the lymphatic system, specifically going right into the lymph nodes. So B lymphocytes, T lymphocytes, we often find them in lymph nodes. Where do they go from there? Well, lymph nodes will feed into other lymphatic vessels, which will feed into other nodes. Eventually, these all collect into a vessel that empties into your circulatory system in your chest. So the lymph vessels will collect all the fluid, and eventually that fluid goes back into your circulatory system, and the B cells and T cells back into your blood. So again, when you're why are we talking about this? Well, we got to think about where immune cells are and where pathogens are. Pathogens can be in your tissues, so that means we need immune cells in the tissues like macrophages, neutrophils, dendritic cells. Pathogens can get drained to these lymph nodes, or remember, if we're talking about the malt or the balt or the galt, these lymphoid tissues that are embedded in the gut, embedded in the bronchial tissue. And in there, we're going to see cells like B cells and T cells interact with these pathogens, recognize them, and hopefully attack. What else do we have here? Let's see. There's a little image, for example, of gut-associated lymphoid tissue, the galt. And again, when you think about your digestive tract involved in absorbing nutrients, digesting your food, breaking down macromolecules, within some of those structures, for example, in your small intestine, you have these patches called Peyer's patches. It's lymphoid tissue. And again, what are you going to find in lymphoid tissue? You're going to find immune cells. For example, B cells and T cells. We'll see dendritic cells there as well. But we'll get to those later. Don't worry about it. We're just introducing these concepts. So this lymphoid tissue can sample the environment, can take in pathogens. And if that's the case, that's where you're going to have some immune cells who, again, travel to these lymphoid tissues using the circulatory system, recognize the pathogen, and hopefully remove it from the body. So this video hopefully will introduce you to the concepts that immune cells can be found in lots of different places. When we learn each of these cells, we'll learn about what they do when they're there, how they recognize the pathogen. Thank you.